Well, welcome back to Chthonica, the show about horror in all its fictional forms. I'm Greg Green, your co-host, and I am absolutely thrilled with our guest today. Along with me, Edward Meehan, my good friend Edward. Hi, Edward. And
Everybody.
Edward's co-hosting with me today, and we have two guests who are dark stars in the horror firmament, and that's Nathan Ballingrud, Michael Wehunt. You'll recognize Nathan as the author of the groundbreaking short story collections North American Lake Monsters and Wounds, now actually published under its originally intended title, The Atlas of Hell. As well as the novel The Strange. There it is. We've got that special edition of Atlas of Hell there. His novel The Strange, and then the Lunar Gothic trilogy, starting with Crypt of the Moon Spider that we got in 2024, and now the new book Cathedral of the Drowned, coming out in just a couple of weeks. Also, if you are not aware of this, a couple of his works have been adapted to film. We've got the feature film called Wounds, based on his novella The Visible Filth, on Hulu. Also, the Hulu series Monsterland is based on several of the stories out of North American lake monsters. Nathan, just absolutely delighted to have you on the show.
I really appreciate it. I'm happy to be here.
And then we're also extraordinarily happy to have the author Michael Wehunt with us. Michael is the author of two short collections, Greener Pastures and The Inconsolables, a novella, Everything is Beautiful and Nothing Bad Can Ever Happen Here, a bunch of uncollected short stories, and then a new novel, which we are going to discuss tonight, which is The October Film Hunt. So Michael, welcome, and we're very excited to talk with you tonight.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here. I haven't seen Nathan in a long time. It's good to meet, if you want to call it that, Greg and Edward.
Awesome. Well, we're thrilled to have you both on the show. So let's kick off. I want to start with Cathedral of the Drowned. And this is going to be a non-spoiler episode, but we would try to keep it spoiler-free on the show. But Nathan, can you give us a spoiler-free synopsis of Cathedral of the Drowned? What are people getting into? And I guess you might have to back up just a little bit and talk about the Lunar Gothic trilogy in general.
Yeah, it's one that's kind of difficult to conceptual or to condense into a little blurb. It is a follow-up to Crypt of the Moon Spider, in which one of the side characters, whose name is Charlie Duchamp, has essentially been bisected into two versions of himself. One of which is still hanging on the wall of a madhouse on the moon, and the other of which has been, his essence has been essentially been put into a jar, stuck onto a satellite, and shot off into space, and it crashes onto one of Jupiter's moons, Io, which in my story is a volcanic jungle moon, and he has a little adventure there, and it also has a side story dealing with a woman named Goodnight Maggie, who is kind of a low rent crime boss in Brooklyn, New York. This is all in the 1920s.
I talked to Alma Katsu recently about her new book Fiend. She did, and then I asked her to give me a synopsis, and she said it's Succession but horror. That really encapsulates it. But yeah, like you said, how do you encapsulate something like the Lunar Gothic trilogy and what you've done with Crypt of the Moon Spiders and now Cathedral of the Drowned? It's such a wild story. I was also just noticed how while Crypt of the Moon Spider is, yes, gothic, and there's some horror elements, it seems like with Cathedral of the Drowned, you really are leaning full tilt into horror in this one. I wonder, was that intentional to try to, just want to turn up the heat, or perhaps did the story just kind of lead you in that direction?
Much more, that's just where the story went. I really don't think a lot about what genre I'm trying to use or fit into. At this point in my life, I'm quite comfortable with everything just being thrown into a great big cauldron. All the things that I like, whether you call it horror, gothic, whatever, crime fiction, pulp stories, the covers of old, like EC horror comics those kinds of things. Everything's just kind of in this pot, and it all gets made into a soup. And so a little bit of everything tends to be in there, especially in stories like this, which I think of as like my more maximalist stories. It's just like it's just I just go wherever it feels like it wants to go, and I don't ask questions.
It's funny you brought up EC Comics because of some of their science horror stories, some of those covers in particular, really, like Charlie Duchamp's brain blasting off in the satellite to Io would go very well on a cover of like EC kind of EC Comics Galaxy of Fear type comics.
Yeah, that was absolutely an inspiration. The idea of, it's like, well, would this fit on a comic of the old one of those old EC magazines? And yes, it would, very comfortably. So I was like, well, then full steam ahead.
Awesome. I love that. In Crypt of the Moonspider, the first book of the Lunar Gothic trilogy, Veronica Brinkley is the protagonist. Charlie Duchamp is there. He's kind of an orderly / enforcer, and not an insignificant character there. But he gets a great big promotion to protagonist in Cathedral of the Drowned. How did he get the promotion to protagonist? And I'd also love to know, without asking for any spoilers for book 3, have we already met the protagonist of book 3?
So that and the answer to that question is absolutely yes.
All right.
The answer to the other one is probably about halfway through. I didn't know that there was going to be more to Crypt until I got to the section of the narrative in which we leave Veronica's point of view and go to Charlie's point of view. And I liked writing him so much. And as soon as I was in his head, I could, I saw other parts of this whole setting. And I just started to figure out, well, how does this thing work in Brooklyn? Like, what is this crime thing going on with Maggie? And what's the larger picture here? And, once I decided to just kind of look out that window, I saw that there was a lot more potential. And I really wanted to spend some more time with Charlie, who was just so much fun to write. And so, yeah, not only is that where I figured out that's where Charlie was going to be the protagonist of the following story, but that's also where I figured out there would be a following story.
How early in the writing of Crypt of the Moonspider then did you realize, hey, this is a trilogy? It sounds like you didn't know going in that it would be a trilogy. Okay.
Yeah, no, not at first. At first, it was just a self-contained story. As I say, it's once I got to Charlie's viewpoint, and then it occurred to me that there was a lot more. Well, and also what occurred to me is that the stories, both of them so far, are a lot about, among other things, perspective. And so the how one sees something will depend upon, and where you are will depend on how you see it. And so I became very interested in the thought of writing 3 stories, each with a different point of view character, and each not seeing the same thing from different points of view, but successive moments in the narrative, but each from a different point of view. So in the first one, we have Veronica, and that is in and of itself a complete story. That's Veronica's story. Even though she appears later, she has this self-contained tale. And now we have Charlie. And Charlie, this happens directly after Crypt, but it's still its own self-contained tale. So when we come to the end, we've come to the end of Charlie's point, his primary role in the story. Mm-hmm. In part 3, this is not really a spoiler because it's going to be in the teaser at the end, will be from Dr. Cull's point of view. And Dr. Cull, for whomever hasn't read any of these, is essentially the main antagonist. He's like the mad doctor sort of character. And that will be, again, taking place sequentially after the first 2, but it will be his own contained story. But of course, the end of that story will also have to be the end of the other 2 as well. So,
and it sounds like that's going to be called The Kingdom of the Conqueror Worm. I think you mentioned correct. On social media. Okay, yeah. Very, very excited about that. Charlie, as you mentioned earlier, Charlie Duchamp exists in something of a bifurcated state throughout the story. I wonder, is that just part of the splitting up his person is that part of the warp and weave of this kind of a fantastical narrative, or is there maybe something thematic about Charlie being split up like that?
Well, there's definitely something thematic about it. I would say the answer is both. It's where the story naturally goes, but of course, it's not just for plot reasons that happens. It's also part of the intent of the story, all of the storylines, the whole arc, which is, as I say, exploring in certain ways questions of identity, self-perception, a self-regard. One of the tropes of Gothic literature is the Doppelgänger, so I wanted to play with that a little bit in Cathedral, and the idea of facing off against oneself, and the way these two versions of him regard the other are quite different. Well, so there was that, and there was also how these two versions are regarded by another character named Maggie, who has got a very particular interest in Charlie, which gets complicated throughout this narrative. There are these two iterations are quite different from each other. So the question arises, at least in my mind, is it truly the man that she's interested in, or is it the aspect, of this particular aspect of the man that she wants? His usefulness, or what role does he fill? And I think I feel myself getting more and more abstract as I go along, because of course no one's read this yet. So I guess I should probably leave it there. But yes, it's very much a part of what the story is about, as well as just being the way the plot wanted to move.
I love that, though, that idea of exploring the doppelganger out of Gothic literature, and it very much, and there's a little kind of some Jekyll and Hyde aspect to it as well.
I thought of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde when you were talking about the two halves of the character. Was that intentional or unintentional? Do you feel like that was floating around in the ether when you kind of constructed the two halves?
Well, it was definitely in the soup pot, because I'm a big Stevenson fan, and I've read Jekyll and Hyde a couple of times in my life, but it wasn't conscious. What was conscious was the doppelganger. I was thinking about mainstays of Gothic fiction, and I knew that the doppelganger was one. I said, well, that would be an interesting one to play with in Cathedral, especially considering what happens to Charlie at the end of the first installment. So no, I wasn't thinking specifically of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but I was thinking specifically of doppelgangers. Although looking back, it's clear that Jekyll and Hyde is, well, it's the most famous manifestation of that trope, I think, in the literature.
You brought up Goodnight Maggie. She's really like the mastermind of a crime family. And she's been around. She's a tough lady. She does have a kind of a family that she's trying to protect. And Charlie's as you mentioned, Charlie's very important to her. Tell us about Goodnight Maggie.
Maggie is one of my favorite kinds of character to write, in which she is very damaged. She is cruel and mean, but she's also confused and yearns for something soft and good in her life. But she's kind of built up such a structure around herself that she's unable ever to access that. And which is much like Charlie. And I think this is what they recognize in each other. They both view themselves as being monstrous people, and they are monstrous people. But she views Charlie as a kind of as kind of one of her, as she seems like a kind of mother figure to Charlie. He sees her that way, but that's also confused with the more adult attraction that men and women have. So they approach each other from these confused angles, and they don't even really know what it is themselves that they want. And I think that their confusion, tends to fire off some uglier sort of reactions and actions from them throughout the story. Yes, I love characters that are just on the surface awful and harsh, and yet when you dig into them, you just complicate that picture. Because one of the things that I find frustrating as a reader, especially in genre fiction, but in any kind of fiction, is the simplicity of the antagonist. If there's or even the protagonist is too light, too pure, then I get bored very quickly as well. I think we all as people are just a bunch of contradictions. We all have the same darkness inside of us and the same light inside of us. It's always entangled. It's always a struggle, I think, to navigate the tension between the two. And characters like that allow me to do it in a really sort of direct way.
You mentioned that, yes, the broken protagonist, the broken person as that protagonist. I'm thinking not just Charlie Duchamp, but to a degree, Jack Oleander, Fat Gully, Mr. Gully from The Butcher's Table, Goodnight Maggie,
Sally Milkwood in The Strange.
Oh yes, absolutely. But also, you mentioned like the perception of people. You wonder, like, when you have someone like Charlie Duchamp, everyone's perception of him is he's a thug, and let's make good use of him if we can use his violence. So people are kind of living under the weight of other people's perceptions of them.
Yeah, and that's how he perceives himself as well. And when he can't do that thing that he's supposed to, he defines himself as being good at, then he feels a kind of helpless frustration and a sort of unanchored. He finds himself in an unanchored state.
You mentioned a moment ago that genre is something you're especially interested in assigning to your stories. The Lunar Gothic trilogy, you could say, is certainly Gothic fiction or dark fantasy or dark adventure. Edward, I know we were talking and you were saying that you thought certain elements of it were also like maybe cosmic horror.
I feel like there are elements that go in that direction. I grabbed the book. I don't want to read it because it's on page 39 and could be construed as a spoiler, but there's a paragraph in there that depicts a realm that to me feels very much like a realm of cosmic horror. I feel like a lot of it too, when you guys were discussing it, like, I know people said that The Strange, like people compared that to Ray Bradbury, but a lot of it feels like really honest science fiction. Like we're talking about horror, but it feels very science fiction and kind of captures the imagination in that way. So if we're going to throw a genre at it, I like science fiction a lot.
When you talk to people about the book and they ask you what genre it is, what's your like standard response for the Lunar Gothic trilogy?
When they ask, I'll just say horror, because I think that is closer than anything else. I think more a true honest. I think of it more like dark fantasy. But those words, one of the reasons I get uncomfortable with these kinds of labels is because regardless of what we think as writers or like very avid involved readers who are involved in the scene and the discussions, regardless of what we think when we say the word horror or dark fantasy, a lot of other folks have a far more generalized view of it because they're just not, their lives are not focusing them to like think about genre all the time. They're doing their own lives. And so when I say the word horror to the most of the people I know who are not involved in the world that we are, it means it means Stephen King, or it means Friday the 13th. That's what they think. That's what a lot of people think. When I say dark fantasy, the word fantasy makes them think of Tolkien, or makes them think of earlier on in my career. When I started to think about when I got involved, especially when I got into social media and involved in other writer communities, and these kinds of discussions were had all over the place quite frequently. And it really got to the point where it was infesting, my thought process. So that when I would be sitting down to write, I would be thinking, well, what is this? Is it because I didn't think when I wrote the stories in North America Lake Monsters, I never thought of them as horror stories. I thought of them as, I don't know what I thought of them as. I can't really remember. But later on, when they were called horror, I was like, oh, well, yeah, I guess that makes sense. But I wanted to get back. I got to a point where I couldn't just come to the page in a pure state. It was just too complicated by the ideas of definitions, what I call the taxonomies. And it was stifling. And I also found some of the stories I tried to write. I was like, well, I'm going to write a horror story now, and it would affect the way I thought about the story. I don't know if I'm making any sense when I say this, but if I sit down to write a story that turns out to be a horror story, but I'm not thinking about the genre when I start to write, it'll be different than if I sit down and start think to myself, I'm going to write a horror story now. The latter will pull me in a direction that is more confined and more I think influenced by popular ideas of structure or expectation, and I don't want that. And so it took me a while to just utterly purge that kind of thinking from my mind again. And now it doesn't bother me when it comes up, but I can just say quite frankly that I try very hard not to think of it. When I think about when I wrote The Strange, it was very different from the other stories that I've written. But I didn't care. I knew its flavor. I could feel the shape of it, and I could hear the sound of it. So it didn't matter what people called it. I knew what it was. It was its own thing. Same with Lunar Gothic. It's like I think about. I do have some touchstones in this case: the Hammer horror, EC horror, Gothic. But I chose those myself, and it's like, all right, these are going to be my touchstones, and whatever shape it takes will be that shape. I'm not going to worry if it's going to be called horror or Gothic or cosmic horror or whatever. Probably it'll have a little bit of all that in there because I love all of it, and it's just going to all get stirred into the pot. You know what I mean?
I do love how Stephen Graham Jones talks about hearing Joe Lansdale years and years ago at a conference. Joe and Stephen were both on a panel. Stephen's pretty young in his writing career. Joe's been at it for a while. And someone in the audience asked Joe, what genre do you write in? And he immediately replied, I write in the Joe R. Lansdale genre. Next question. I think the freedom there is, and yeah, what genre does Stephen write in? A lot of people know him for horror. Well, also for slasher. Well, also for science fiction. He's done sword and sorcery, fantasy, and then non-genre, literary fiction. So it's can't really put him in a corner in that sense. It's I guess you could say with the Lunar Gothic trilogy, you've got some predecessors to it.
There's one that I keep like is the North Star, and that's Edgar Allan Poe. Poe is at the forefront. He's how I set my compass when I'm in these stories. I can just aware of his presence, at all times.
Nathan, how do you feel like Cathedral of the Drowned connects to like themes that you've been doing throughout your career? Like, do you feel like it has similarities? Do you feel like you're doing something different?
I think it definitely has similarities. I think the theme that I come back to again and again is people trying to find love. I really think that's about it. They don't have it. They need it. They want it. They do have it, and it turns them or twists them in ways that they may not always expect it to. I think that's always been that, and the parent-child relationship. Those are, as far as I'm aware, those are the two big things I keep coming back to. There might be others that I'm not aware of, but that's so. But I think the first one, especially, and this one is at its heart.
I wanted to ask both of you guys. So I've emailed with Michael, and I know Michael has read some of Nathan's stuff. And Nathan, we haven't talked before this. Do you guys have favorites from each other's catalogs? Like, what is your, Nathan, what is your favorite Michael Wehunt story or book, and vice versa?
Oh, well, I think, geez. I'm not going to say favorite because that gives the wrong flavor. But to the answer, but Greener Pastures was the first time I'd ever read Michael's work, and it was just such a breath of fresh air. Because as you know, we're all there you go. I love that cover too. But we're inundated all the time with this avalanche of fiction coming from all directions. And a lot of it's good. Some of it's okay. And some of it's exciting. But when I read Greener Pastures, it was fresh. It felt new. It felt entirely competent. By which I mean, it didn't feel like a first book. It felt like somebody who was already in complete control of their powers. And it was strange in a way that I just found delightful. I find more and more as I get older that I just want strange. I don't want to be reading the same old thing. And I always get that with Michael's fiction. But because Greener Pastures was the first, I remember it very clearly as being really special.
Yeah, Michael, how about you?
Part of me wants to choose a similar tactic and say North American Lake Monsters. It was my introduction to Nathan. I think I read that book before I had read any individual stories in any anthologies. And I just felt an immediate and powerful kinship with it. I used to think that I was glad I didn't read that collection before I started writing because I was like a baby writer. I was like, anything would have scared me off, but I feel like I would have been scared to try to do what I wanted to do because it was already being done so well. And, not too much time passed before I was kind of forging my own thing. And, I felt like myself and I didn't worry about being boxed in with anybody else. But every story in North American Lake Monsters has sentimental value for me. But I'm going to choose The Butcher's Table or The Visible Filth, both of which are collected in the Atlas of Hell. The Visible Filth is just so incredibly creepy, and it kind of took the best of Laird Barron, like tapping into some next level of creepiness that I experience so rarely as a reader, and I'm always looking for. But it also was very, very much Nathan, and I felt like it left that quietness from North American Lake Monsters a little bit in the rearview mirror and did something a little crazier. But then The Butcher's Table is just such an incredible story, and it's like I remember reading it and thinking Nathan was already so good, but he's grown. He's practically a master at this point, and it's just like it made a really, really strong impression on me. So to go back around and answer your question, I'm going to choose The Visible Filth. I'm going to stick with that one. It has such a special place in my heart, and I can't remember the woman's name in the story. I really wish I could, but she's played by Dakota Johnson in the movie.
Carrie.
Yes, when he finds her staring at the computer and just like completely lost, and just it's something I've read before in various fiction and novels and stories, but it was just that scene was just so phenomenal, and it's just really tapped into the power of what was going on in that story. And what started off as an abandoned cell phone ends up in this netherworld on the internet, and it's just it was so great. So that's my final answer.
Awesome. Thank you both for indulging us in that. And yeah, such special work from Nathan. And I'd say if I were to choose a favorite or the one that keeps coming back to me the most, but The Butcher's Table would certainly be in there. That was one of these books I felt like stories I felt like was dangerous to read, probably because like there's no one in that story who is, and especially who really kind of is classified as a hero. They're protagonists, but all of them have very, very dark agendas. And then same thing, I guess with October Film Hunt. This felt dangerous for me to read. There's this movement throughout that is trying to break down the barrier between the story contained and me, the reader, and it made me a bit nervous. So why don't we go ahead and jump into October Film Hunt?
So, Michael, we want to ask you the same thing we asked Nathan. Could you give us a spoiler-free synopsis of your new novel?
Sure. Well, the October Film Hunt essentially revolves around a cult horror film that came out in the late 2000s called Proof of Demons. And it's not just a popular horror movie, it's actually rumored to have an occult ritual embedded in it. and it develops quite a fan base online because of that. And it's to the point where there's an entity in the film that people claim they've seen in real life. So an urban legend has sprung up from this movie over several years. And Reddit forums and social media accounts, like you just see little mentions of it here and there. So it's developed quite a reputation. Nobody knows who the director is. They only know that it's supposedly this woman named Elaine Enriquez. So the novel opens with a woman named Jory Stroud, and she's a single mother in her late 30s, and she used to be one of three members of a group called the October Film Hunt. And these three best friends would go camp out at filming locations of beloved horror movies, and they ran a blog that partly used their thoughts and impressions, the atmosphere of these filming sites, and they would just write about their experiences, and they became really, really big, really influential. They all had these amazing futures in the horror entertainment world ahead of them, but then they chose Proof of Demons as one of their film hunts and spent the night in a cemetery from one of the scenes in that movie, and then bad things started to happen. Um, Someone died, and then someone else died, and a lot of controversy erupted, and Jory was forced to leave horror behind. So she left her burgeoning career. She left her horror fandom, her love of horror movies and books. She left it all behind and just started a new life. Now she lives in northern Vermont with her 8-year-old son, and she is completely without horror in any form. But then one day, a VHS tape shows up in her mailbox, because of course it does. And it soon becomes apparent that Proof of Demons might have a sequel in the works. And bad things start to happen. And meanwhile, the surviving member of the October Film Hunt, one of the stars from the original Proof of Demons film, a well-known horror artist, and an accountant who, importantly, has no interest in horror and doesn't care remotely about horror, all find themselves being pulled into the orbit of this film. And that's where we start off, basically.
The film Proof of Demons, is that based on any real life films? We wondered if perhaps the Blair Witch Project, because, before everything kind of came out about that, there was a lot of speculation. Like, I was 18 at the time. I thought it was real. It was horrifying when I saw it in the theater. Um, did you make any of those kind of connections, or was it totally like an original creation?
The marketing campaign for the Blair Witch Project certainly was on my mind. How so many people thought it was real and it was an actual documentary. I was careful to make Proof of Demons not a found footage movie. It has, certain elements of it, but it's clearly within the framework of the novel. It's clearly a movie that has cinematography and camera framing and all the tools of making a film. It's not people walking around with cameras on their shoulders. So I wanted to set it apart from Blair Witch. But yeah, there are definitely some similarities that I wanted to be there, and that movie would appeal to fans of the Blair Witch Project. And then, Blair Witch kind of had an urban legend aspect to it. I don't remember really hearing any people say like, "Oh, we went to Burkittsville, Maryland, and we saw the Blair Witch," or anything like that. But my mind would kind of wonder, what if that had happened? And then, like, as far as filmic references that I pulled, I would kind of have to go kind of cheat a little bit and go back to the internet and say Slender Man was sort of an influence on Proof of Demons, because the entity in it has a little bit of a similarity to Slender Man. And I also wanted to draw a correlation with the terrible stabbings that happened about 11 years ago. The two Yeah, the two young girls who thought Slender Man was telling them to murder one of their classmates, and then they actually did it. So, but yeah, Blair Witch is there, but I wanted to have keep Blair Witch at more of an oblique angle.
I wondered if there was a film that stylistically would be similar or some kind of a predecessor to it, because Proof of Demons is it's pretty strange. There are sections that are just regular narrative from what we're reading about it, and then there are moments where it'll go through like 6 minutes of the camera's not moving. You're just witnessing maybe a little bit of motion on the screen, and then something happens. Very kind of maybe an avant-garde or maybe like 60s expressionism or something like that. Did you take inspiration from any particular films for some of the stranger elements in the film?
Yeah, I did think about a movie called Antrum, because it was Antrum is a movie that came out about 10 years ago, and it's kind of set up like a documentary about a cursed movie. Anybody who watches it dies, and the documentary is like a framing device, and then in the documentary they show the film, and it's a kind of a disjointed film that doesn't really follow a narrative. Kind of like Ben Wheatley's A Field in England. It's just almost psychedelic, and like puts your mind on a trip. I definitely wanted Proof of Demons to have more of a narrative flow and more of a traditional structure than that. But yeah, you do have these segments that do lean avant-garde, and that fueled the speculation that this is actually like a mathematical formula that has an occult influence. And if you're watching the movie, you're participating in an occult ritual. And then, the rumors kind of start swirling about that. Like, why is this pretty normal movie have all these 6-minute segments where the camera just doesn't do anything? Like, what does that mean? I wanted that like really bizarre mystery to be inside of this fairly straightforward horror movie.
The through line of the novel is really about eroding the barrier between fiction and reality, the reality inside the novel. And there are even moments there where you start to work on the barrier between the novel and our real life world. In particular, the inclusion of a real world person. I'm not going to name the person. I just try to stay spoiler free. But my guess is most people who read the October film Haunt are going to know who this person is. Tell us a little bit about your decision to include that real person, because I'll just tell you, when I read the person's name, I'm like, whoa, I know that person. Like, I've exchanged emails with this person before. Am I going to show up at some point in this book? And it's just kind of the kind of the fear that you want. You want to think, oh my gosh, what if this could be real? And I just thought it was absolutely brilliant that you brought a real world person into it. Without asking you to name who it is, tell us a little bit about your thought process for that. And was that an easy thing to do? To, I assume, get the person's permission to include them in this book?
Yeah, it was very easy. I went into the book because like you kind of touched on, the theme is what's real, what's not. How do you know nowadays? Um, Actually, I'm really glad I wrote this book before AI started taking over our lives, because I would have had to write it differently, and it would have been even more chaotic inside the story world. But even before AI really started drowning us, it had become really difficult to know what you can trust on the internet. So I wanted the book to kind of play around with that, and I wanted to mix in real things and fake things at the same time. So, just to very slightly disorient the reader. Like, I would have a list of 3 horror movies that one of the characters mentions, and 2 of them are real, and one of them I made up. And then I would have a couple of directors mentioned in an interview. One of them's real, one of them's not real. And then I had another one that's not real, but named after a real horror writer. Um, so I was kind of trying all these little tricks to just befuddle people, just not even in a way they would be aware of, just in the back of their mind. and then I, introduced this character as I was mapping the book out. I wanted I wanted the artist who had originally drawn the entity in Proof of Demons to be a character in the book. And so I started writing that character, and in my mind I had been thinking and visualizing that entity as a creation of this real horror artist who we're not naming. And so it kind of, the weirdness of the entity, the uncanniness, the awfulness of it, kind of it just
The
kind of
skin, the way you describe its skin, I'm like, yeah, that's exactly how this artist would draw it. It totally makes sense.
So then I just had the idea, is like, why don't it would yet another the biggest way so far to blur that line between fiction and reality would be to ask this person if I can go ahead and make them the character. It just felt so right. So I reached out to them, and they were very enthusiastic. And as I went along and, finally finished the book, I sent them all the chapters, because they ended up being a POV character, so pretty important to the book. I sent them all their chapters and a couple of other chapters that mentioned them, just so they could read and, make sure they were okay with the way they were represented, the way their partner was represented, because I wanted it to be very realistic while also being entirely fictional, of course. It almost was like the book kind of went into a higher gear when I made that decision, because like the themes, maybe the blending or blurring the line between fiction and fact was very important to me, but I hadn't really been thinking of it as something that would be overt and like on the surface level of the story. But once I made that decision about that artist, I was like, oh, this is really starting to rise up and become a more prominent, uh, tangible theme. So I'm just going to run with it. And it just kind of made everything a little more weighty, I think.
Yeah, a little more disarming and unsettling for sure. Yeah, I just kept looking at that, saying, I know this person. Actually is kind of how the person talks. I've heard them on interviews enough, and they're like, hey, no, that actually fits them. I do have to ask. There is a particular creature that is referenced and that is mentioned and described pretty early on in the book. I don't think there's any spoiler that there's a monster in this book. Has this artist actually drawn that creature?
No, but they are hoping to clear their plate so that they can.
Okay.
I don't know if it's
Awesome.
actually going to happen, but they are very, very busy. And I told them, if you have too many commissions and too many, because they have a lot going on, let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
You don't get around to it, please don't worry about it. Don't feel obligated. Like the main part of me doesn't even want to have any visual input from this artist, because I want it to be, because I know so much gravity would be given to that because they're known as an artist. I part of me just would prefer to have the fictional characters speak for themselves, but obviously a drawing or a painting would be awesome, and I would eagerly welcome it.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't just about blurring that line. It was also, because I think the main theme of the book is just belief in general, and this was a way to steer that and bring it out more. Is just one of the lines that's mentioned several times is, will you believe in what you made? And the artist made something here in this story. Jory, the main character, she made something, and everybody has these things that they made. And meanwhile, there's a whole world out there on social media and Reddit and places like that, reading these things and believing them when there's no real reason to believe them. So that can be weaponized. People can be out there taking advantage of those things. And it's more and more becoming a horror just not knowing what's real. So that artist, putting that artist in there was like the icing on the cake. It made everything gel together, I think.
There's a line in there. One of the characters says, horror is in some ways a genre of transcendence. And you play a lot with the ideas of fear as worship, the distinction between faith, knowledge, and belief. And characters keep, starting with your protagonist, your main character, Jory Stroud. There were points early in her life when she and her two friends are going around visiting these filming locations in October, and just kind of sitting there and writing down their thoughts as they sit on this location. What is it that they hope to get out of horror? Is it something like, hoping that maybe there's more to life than what would be embraced by deterministic naturalism, the possibility of afterlife or immortality, or I get the sense that people miss monsters. There was a time when people thought if you got on a ship and you went far enough out in the ocean, you might run into something that is beyond human ken. What are you thinking there with horror being a genre of transcendence? Can you elaborate on that some?
By transcendence, I kind of just mean just having passion for it, but I also, it does have many other layers and many other meanings, because there's some people love horror because, like you said, they want to believe that there's something beyond all this or after all this, like after death, after the mundanity of daily life, whatever you want to say. And horror has always examined that in a particular way and, speculated about it. But it's also transcendent because it's a visceral thing more than any other genre, in my opinion, because, I think we all agree horror is the best genre. So I don't want to make such a blanket statement, but it's my favorite genre for sure. It's just, there's something visceral about it. Like, even though I don't get frightened while I'm watching a scary movie or reading a horror story, the really, really good ones will kind of either make a chill run up my skin, or the thought of a chill, like even if I don't experience the chill, there's still that precursor there for me. And ever since I was a little kid, I've just been chasing that. And the chasing of
You
it,
watched The Exorcist at a young age, I think, from
yeah,
what I read.
when I was 7, actually. So, and my mom kept an eye on me. She said I didn't have any nightmares. So she's like, okay. So the next time I asked to watch a scary movie, she let me. But um, the chasing of that feeling to me is kind of like transcendence, because it kind of takes on a mythic power. It kind of takes on an almost occult power. And I know that it's fiction. I know it's not real, but then my mind starts to turn and turn and turn. It's like, well, what if it were real? And, that kind of started to make its way into this story where um, somebody who loves horror so much, part of them wants these things to be real.
Yeah.
What if they actually were? How would that turn the tables, and how would they react to that? And so I wanted a character who was so deeply immersed in horror and then cut it out of their lives. I wanted a character who's still immersed in horror. I wanted a character who isn't really immersed in horror, but was only into it because they're interested in the occult, like the real stuff. Like they're truly searching for demons and other dimensions.
Proof of demons, yeah.
Exactly. And I wanted a character who has nothing to do with any of it, just a completely blank slate in terms of the horror genre. So that gave me all these different ways to look at these topics. So it's going to be transcendent for each of them in a slightly different way, at least in my mind. But yeah, when you look at it from an occult or demonology sort of perspective, then that it can be very transcendent, because there's the possibility of those things being real. You can bring religion into it, or, as I prefer, a more secular explanation into it. But even if you're just a horror fan and you're just, listening to this or watching this, like, there's still a transcendence there, because I believe that there's a feeling that being scared gives you that isn't emulated in any other way. And when you experience horror, you're being scared in a safe way. And I know it's so fundamental and simple, but it holds such power for me. So when I'm digging into that and just really just talking about loving horror so much, I'm loving the uncanny, the weird, the unexplainable, the inscrutable, so much that it starts to become transcendent, because it transcends all these other things in your life. It transcends the explanations you use for the other things in the world that just feel different, and horror rises above all those.
And thank you. And Nathan, what do you think people are looking for? And I don't mean just like casual, viewers of, hey, when I was 14, I saw a Nightmare on Elm Street, but people who really go after horror fiction, horror film. What do you think they're looking for? What do you think they hope to get out of it?
Well, I'm struck by Michael's observation that horror is a way to be scared safely. I think that is kind of the crux of it. I think it is a way of reckoning with death. It is death is something that we have really kind of pushed to the into the corners in our culture. It's like we don't like to talk too much about it or acknowledge it. Even when I think about when we're our own funeral processes, if we're cremated, it's a very clean process, or even if we're put into a coffin where it's vacuum sealed, we're protected from the soil and the things that live in the soil from doing the work of nature and breaking us down. Uh, all of it is just as so far a remove, unless it's thrust in our faces in these spectacular acts of violence, in which case it's revealed that we have an appetite for it. We watch these videos repeatedly, and I think I think the attraction to the horror genre is a way of reckoning with that same impulse. It's like we know death is there. We know we're mortal. We know it's coming. We don't know anything about what's beyond. We have our ideas and our theories. We have different ways of reckoning with the possibilities, but in fact, we just don't know. And so, I think that's what horror is. It's a way to grapple with it, to grapple with our fear of it, and of escaping it or succumbing to it, or as Michael said too. I also hold to the idea that horror is a literature of transcendence. Because death may even be that. We may not be just extinguished. Maybe we may be just moving on to something else. But in whatever the case, we are transitioning from one state to another. We just don't know what that next state is. And I think that's what horror is about.
I was going to ask Nathan a question. When Nathan was talking about earlier kind of the light and the dark parts of ourself, Nathan, do you feel like people that really get into horror, it's a way for us to activate those dark parts of ourselves? Like if we're internally grappling with lightness and dark, do you feel like horror films, like reading a lot of horror literature? I mean, I've been into like real dark heavy metal for a long time. Do you feel like those are all ways that we kind of, I don't know, ignite that darkness within us?
I do think that there are so many different gradients of horror that it can do a lot of different things, of course, and I think some of it is a way of diluting ourselves, that we don't have that darkness in us. I think a lot of it does the work of making it an external force, an intrusion from somewhere else that we have to repel. And I think, and this is just off the top of my head. If I think about this more, I might change my mind. But my first instinct when I think about that kind of horror is to think that is not a way of grappling with what's interior. That's a way of well, it can be a way of avoiding doing that, or at the very least, it just doesn't do that work. It's not interested in doing that work, which is fine. But I do think there is a lot of horror that does do that work, and I think the first one that comes to mind is Clive Barker, the contemporary writer, in which the monsters are often the protagonists, in which transcendence through horror is one of the key themes of his work. But I also think you find that in a lot of Gothic fiction. I think you can find that. We were talking about Stevenson earlier. The Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is an obvious example of that. I think you can see that with Frankenstein. And so, yes, I do think a lot of horror does that, but I don't necessarily think all of it does. I wouldn't say that's a blanket characteristic of the genre.
And so this is for both of you guys. I was kind of reflecting on your careers in total, and it seems like you both have a gravity towards writing about mental health. Like Michael, you've written a ton, in my opinion, about grief. Some of my favorite stuff are your grief-heavy stories. You guys have written about abusive relationships, like The Good Husband had that squicky codependent thing. Michael, Everything is Beautiful and Nothing Bad Can Ever Happen Here was about racism, like a big focus was racism. Why have you guys both focused so much on kind of these visceral mental health topics? The joke I was going to make, and this is a total joke, like, why are you guys both so depressing? But like, why do you guys explore these themes in your writing so much?
Well, I write about grief a lot. Because I really haven't experienced the major grief points yet. Both of my parents are still alive. My siblings are alive, and I know that there are these bigger, heavier moments coming to me. And even aside from my own personal relations, I've always been fascinated with grief and death. And Nathan kind of said, horror is a way we grapple with those things, not just the material fact of death, but the emotional wake of it and the wreckage it leaves behind for everybody else. That's always really interested me too. And I think, horror is a way to explore loss and mourning and sorrow. And, horror welcomes broken people into it, as characters, as readers in a lot of cases, I'm sure. And it's just, regret, the past comes back to haunt us, that kind of thing. And it's just, really interesting. And I don't think I've written a lot about truly bad people, at least from a point of view kind of perspective. Like my POV characters are normally broken by their actions, but their actions don't super often damage other people, and particularly in a physical violence kind of way. But yeah, mental health, depression, grief, it's just there's such, I don't want to say easy vehicles for horror, but they lend themselves really well. And I just always had a fascination, and so many different horror tropes. Like I wrote a novella once where these two unhappy spouses haven't been communicating with each other. They've almost stopped talking and they're drifting apart. They're drifting toward divorce. They're having all these troubles. And I just stick a mime in the story, because what more obvious symbol of not talking is there? Obviously, a mime is going to be that symbolism. So I was like, let's use the really obvious symbol and kind of build a story around this obvious thing. And mental health, regret, depression, whatever, it's a really interesting way for me to turn tropes on their head, or kind of try to put my stamp on a trope. And it's just, again, horror is a very useful genre, because people like to say sometimes that it's a mirror we hold up to society. to talk about our ills and our crimes and our sins. Like you mentioned, my novella, Everything is Beautiful and Nothing Bad Can Ever Happen Here. And why did I give it such a long name? That dealt with the sin of racism and the wreckage that has left behind and continues to inflict. Just horror holds up a mirror to society, but it can also be turned around. You can hold up a mirror to yourself and really dig into these things we might not think about too much otherwise.
Nathan, do you want to respond to Edward's question?
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what Michael is saying, and I would add that too, that it's just it's ubiquitous. These things, mental health struggles, depression, grief, all these things. They're a fundamental part of life now. Not everyone experiences them all, and maybe in a clinical sense, but we all experience them in some sense, and so many of us do also in the clinical sense. I know, many people that are extremely important to me in my life that I love have wrestled with mental health issues. And if we are writing about people, which is ultimately what we're doing, this is a fundamentally scary part of the human experience. And so it naturally lends itself to the language of horror. And I think one of the things that has attracted me to horror fiction since I was a kid is that despite its fantastical nature, it is always seemed to be a somewhat more fundamentally honest kind of literature than other kinds. Because I have always felt like that it deals openly with raw emotional or raw feelings, frightening, terrifying feelings. I remember as a kid, thinking that the scariest, and I still think this, the worst sound I've ever heard is the sound of someone quietly crying in another room, and knowing you can do nothing about it. You can't fix it, and that is that's really at the heart of all of that. And so, writing horror fiction, I feel like it's just natural to go to the rawest places in the human experience, and that tends to be where they are.
We talked a little bit about the idea of faith, knowledge, and belief. There's a moment in the October film Haunt when a character says, "Belief leads us to something more real than knowing." Can you elaborate a little bit on that, on within the context of this story, and especially within the context of these characters' obsession with the horror genre? What does belief mean here?
I think the larger thing I'm getting at is just like, I don't want the easiest analog in today's world is politics, because it's the most pervasive element in our lives these days, especially in the US. We're at a time where, people throw out the term post-truth era. Like, we truly are living in a post-truth era, and it starts to become obvious that facts don't really matter anymore. And what you believe, what you want to be true, has more importance to a person, to the point where they just will completely disregard what is true and the science behind it, or the facts, or the data, or whatever behind the issue. They'll just ignore all that stuff. And so for years now, I've been wondering, are we at a point where belief really is more powerful than fact? Because belief wields more political power now. Belief wields more real life changes because legislation is created, laws are passed, policies are enacted, and huge groups of people are turned against other huge groups of people. And none of that has to do with any sort of reality. It's all made up. And so we're at a point where fiction has more influence over people than nonfiction does, which I think is horrifying and scarier than anything I could ever write. But I really did want to kind of tap into that. And I wondered, how would that apply in a horror context? How would that apply to an urban legend? Again, I mentioned the two girls who thought Slender Man was telling them to kill their classmate. That's a real world thing that happened, and it's worse than any horror story because it actually happened, you know. They believed what they believed, and they did this terrible thing. And so I didn't want to like dig deep into social commentary, but I was really fascinated, and I did want to interrogate it a little bit and apply it to the story that I was writing. And if belief truly does become more powerful than reality, then you could almost say that belief has an occult power because it has the ability to make tangible physical changes in the world. And what is the occult if it's not drawing something into reality and changing reality? So that was really the beating heart of the movie and the book itself. And the character motivations as they're moving through the story is in their own way. Each of them has this belief, and what are they going to do with it? Um, you know, Jory doesn't want to believe that these supernatural things, she's kind of like me. She used to want to believe in the supernatural, but she just couldn't get there. And so she turned to the horror genre to kind of fill that desire. Um, but yeah, like at the core of my answer would just be that I feel like belief has an occult power if it reaches a point where it defeats truth, and truth is less important than what you want truth to be. I think we're already there as a society, and I think that is just true horror.
Michael, I wanted to ask you this earlier when you were talking about the creators. So like the motif, and I mean, this was really powerful when I read the arc of the novel, like will you believe in what you made? Like that thing just played in my brain over and over for weeks. Like I wanted to talk to people, like ask people in my life that question. But is there any element of accountability? Like I wanted to ask about the creators of art, but now we've shifted more into a social conversation. Like, will you believe in what you're made? Was it important for you to hold the creators of art accountable, or are you holding larger social forces accountable?
Yeah, I mean, the backstory here is that Jory was more of a content creator, and she was moving into actually writing horror films. Um, but she was a creator, and she was held accountable. She did something really foolish, just really ill advised. And she spent a decade suffering because of that decision that she made, as the story opens up. So, there's accountability there because my artist was a real person in the real world. I had to keep their hands clean. They don't participate in any of the misinformation, and uh, they're not doing anything for selfish reasons, because I tried to make that person like the actual real person. Um, but that character in the book actually kind of comments on accountability and speaks to a reporter about how they participated in this urban legend at first but as they witnessed it becoming more and more real and permeating the real world, and people were believing in it and presumably inventing stories about this fictional thing being real, they stepped away from it because they believed that there should be accountability for that. And there's a snippet of a news article in the book that brings up accountability and what a slippery slope it is, and how difficult it is to pin blame, and then you know pulling back out to the larger social construct, and from a political nature, from a policy and legislation kind of angle. Hopefully there will be accountability there because blurring that line between real and not real is really, really dangerous and really damaging to a lot of people, you know, all different types of people in their own way are going to be damaged by that kind of thing. Whether someone who does believe something hurts them because they believed it, or whether they themselves believe it and hurt others. That question of accountability definitely should be there.
Yes. I wanted to bring up just the topic of social media, because obviously it's a big part of this story. Social media is being used as a to scale out a proposition, a notion that, hey, the barrier is coming down. Like, you can actually have an experience with the supernatural if you do watch this movie, you do this, or don't even watch the movie, just do these steps, and you can experience something. And it's starting to become a viral threat. Obviously, we, in this story, the threat of social media is that it can cause supernatural mayhem. And I'm not writing that off as a possibility with social media. I mean, who knows? But what do you think in our real world? What do you think on balance social media has done? I mean, you guys as authors, this is part of your careers, whether you like it or not, is to engage in social media and try to not just promote your books, but promote yourselves as authors. Would you say on balance it's been, I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth. What's your experience been of social media? Nathan, let's start with you.
Well, I'm one of these guys who, if I could just live in a cave and roll my rock aside and put the manuscript and roll the rock back and never encounter the world at large in any kind of substantial way, I'd do it happily. I'd prefer not even to have my picture on the book, but I think social media has set fire to our world. I think it has been astonishingly destructive for us. It doesn't have to be. It's had some beneficial effects. I think it is like fire. I think that's the best analogy I can think of for it. It can save your life, or it can burn your house down. And right now, it's burning our house down. I think everything that Michael said about the post-truth is dead on. I think the fact that we all can invent our own truths. I can't have a debate with somebody and trust that anything, that our truths have anything to do with each other, that we can even agree on simple, basic principles. We're living almost literally in different worlds, and I think that's just profoundly destructive. Maybe the most dangerous thing that we've faced since since the invention of the atom bomb.
Michael, what's your take on social media?
I'm with Nathan for sure. In my bio, I tend to write things like Michael lives in the woods outside Atlanta, Georgia. And then I'll talk about releasing a new book, and I'll say something like, I'm crawling out of the woods to this because I kind of wish I lived in the woods.
Yeah.
Far away from all this. Social media is a necessary evil, but it goes back to the two truths. Like, you can say something on social media and it'll just snowball and millions of people will potentially see it. And then it no longer matters what the actual truth behind that is. And trying to refute that quickly becomes pointless, and you might as well not even try. And then the better the type of person you are, the purer your soul or whatever, the better your intentions, the more time you're going to have to spend trying to help people on social media, the more energy you're going to have to expend to put some positive light into the internet amongst all this darkness. And, like, I used to be pretty political on Facebook, and I engaged in debates all that, but, Nathan kind of touched on the fact that that's completely worthless nowadays. I don't engage anymore. I don't post political stuff very much. I keep very informed in my private life, and I try to stay up because I have a really busy day job. So I I have day job writing that doesn't leave a lot of time for social media, so I can just kind of pop on there and say, so and so said this about my book. I hope you'll buy it.
Which feels crass when you do it, right?
Yeah, it does feel crass. It really does. And I don't think most people pause to acknowledge the fact that, say there are 10 authors or 10 filmmakers or 10 painters or whatever who are all on the same general field, and they all get on social media, and person one is always posting, always engaging, always sharing and liking and retweeting, and just so passionate about politics and nonprofits and helping people and spreading the word about these great things and fighting the villains. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have person 10 who has 20 minutes a day that they can spend on social media, and they have certain things they need to put here and here and here, and like I'm like a bird carrying the same post across 20 different social media platforms, just dropping it off at each one, and I'm like, oh well, I'm out of time for the day. I have to work on the next book or whatever. So that can make me feel pretty bad about myself, that I'm not able to be online more and engaging, not even just in a social way, but just in a more personalized way where I'm chatting with people and sharing kitten videos and just doing all the lighter stuff that still shines some sort of light out into the darkness. And I'm not there for a whole lot of that. But as Nathan said, it's an incredibly valuable tool, but it's being used for horrific, like generation changing, damaging ways. And I don't know where we're going to go from here, but it's at this moment, it seems like social media will be the reason the world is destroyed.
It's interesting that the notion of connectedness is not necessarily productive or positive.
I also want to point out, though, that I don't think, even if it wasn't quite as radioactive as it currently is, I don't know that it's necessarily good for writers to be spending a lot of time on there anyway. On the one sense, networking, sure, whatever, but at least in my own experience with writing, you have to step away from the kind of froth of that sort of activity, and you have to, if you've been given a story from wherever it comes from, you owe it the time, you owe it silence, you owe it thought, you owe it study, you owe it patience. And in order to do those things, to give it those things, you need long expanses of quietude. You've got to be able to think long thoughts. And I find it very difficult to do that when I get online. Even if I'm not being, bombarded with horror, which of course I always am. But even if that wasn't the case, it's just a constant babbling stream of little thoughts, little snippets here, little it's just being peppered by a million little observations and thoughts, and it turns the water. You can't let the water settle, and you can't sink down to where you need to be to really give yourself to a story, and the story deserves that attention. You owe it that. So I find even irrespective of all this, social media to be a disruptive force.
I have so enjoyed, like, my experience of social media has been, like, overall really pretty good. And I don't get involved in a lot of political discussions or a lot of really controversial subjects. I try to stay away from the drama. And it's just been really a lot of fun. It does eat up a good amount of time, more than I think it should. I've just really enjoyed being able to, like, get to know authors and filmmakers and people whose work inspires me. And I would so much rather you guys just work on writing stories than engaging with people like me on social media, because I feed off of the stories are nurturing to me. The films are nurturing to me. So just that, and I'm just one voice out here as a reader and a watcher. But I'd much rather you guys do the hard work that's going to feed your readers than get on and put a little like on a post I that I made about.
Upside of it, though. That's the upside is this kind of thing, these kinds of relationships. I can't speak for Michael, but I know that I wouldn't have. It's so energizing and galvanizing to hear from readers, which I never would have done, at this level without social media.
Yeah.
And that is, that's beautiful. So yeah, it's not a universal terrible thing.
The sense of community will always have value. Like, that's yet another theme in my book is belonging. And people are looking for something to belong to. And like, in particular, the pandemic made me a work from home person, and I never went back to the office. And I would, because I live in Atlanta, which has horrific traffic, I would cry for weeks if I ever had to go back to an office. But there is a downside to working from home. Is like, I'm always here. I have, my day job and my author job, both of them take place here. And I don't go outside the house very much. And so that really heightens that need for community. So when I do log on to social media, I think there's this semi-naive hope that I'm going to just have a really good brief conversation with somebody, or I'll see somebody say something that will just like lift me up, or maybe I'll be able to say something that lifts somebody up, but that sense of community is very valuable. It's just really difficult to filter out the million things peppering you, like Nathan said.
Michael, the antagonist in October Film Hunt, and I hope we're 90 minutes in this thing. Diehard people are watching this, so I'll just kind of ask it. The film director, could an argument be made that she's not human? Like, I think I was driving to work this morning and thinking about your book, and I was like, nothing says that she is in a like normal way. Could somebody make the argument that she's not?
Yes. I will hint that in my heart she is human, but I don't want to know for sure. She is a diehard, or he, because nobody actually knows the identity of this person. I'm just using, she's presented as a she, so that's how I'm speaking about Enriquez. One of my great loves in life is weird fiction, especially because a lot of that Venn diagram with horror is just, it's almost one circle, but there's like little bulges at the sides where it's weird but not horror, and it's horror but not weird. But I love weird fiction because ambiguity has such prominence and so much value can be put on it, and it just has so much power. It just, a really brilliant ambiguous ending just makes me shiver with delight. I love it so much. I always have. I think that goes back to being a teenager and reading The Bell Jar, which is not weird fiction, by Sylvia Plath. And the book ends with her walking into a room, and what's going to happen in that room is so important, but you're left behind on the other side of the door. And there's just that ambiguity, I think, from a very young age, locked into me and became part of my DNA. But I will do things like leaving open a possibility that Enriquez could be something more than just an occultist, because they are an occultist. So who's to say what an occultist won't stumble across and won't, anybody who's read Laird Barron knows full well that people who dabble in the occult can end up being not human. That's shown many, 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 many times in his work and other people's work. So I do like leaving that door open, and if you want to go through it, you're more than welcome to.
to piggyback on that just a little bit, this is potentially a strange question, but I'd just love to hear people's answers to it. Have you had a paranormal experience, the classics, a encounter with a ghost or an angel or a demon or an extraterrestrial alien? And if not, what would the burden of proof be for you to believe when someone's like, no, I saw a ghost, really? Or even if you experience something like that yourself, you can always think, well, I've lost my mind or I'm hallucinating or something like that. If you've had a paranormal experience, I'd love to hear about that. If you haven't, what would the threshold of acceptance be? I think that threshold of acceptance is the, I'm borrowing a phrase from the October film Haunt. Nathan, can we start with you?
Sure. I have not, to my knowledge. As far as the threshold, what was the phrase?
Threshold of acceptance, or maybe burden of proof. I don't know. Threshold of acceptance is a good way.
It's lower now than it used to be, because as I get older, and this is, I guess, a truism from everyone who gets older, but I am struck by how little I know. I feel like I know less and less, all the time, and I find that, and this is not in the context of the disappearance of truth that we were talking about a few moments ago. This is in a different context, but I find that I find the encroachment of mystery to be thrilling and to be exciting. And the fact that so much of what I took for granted as just being self-evidently true, I don't anymore. And so there are several people in my life who have told me about supernatural experiences they have had. And whereas I might once have dismissed them, I don't anymore. My approach to everything now is simply, I don't know. And I find that a very comfortable place to be.
Michael, how about you?
Same pretty much. I've never experienced anything personally. When I was younger, I tried to seek things out. I would go to local spots, this tiny cemetery that's so old that trees have grown around it, and you have to go into the woods to find it. And a hill where if you park your car and sprinkle baby powder on the back of your car and walk away for 10 or 15 minutes and come back, you'll see children's handprints in the baby powder because a school bus of children died there 30 years earlier, and the ghosts of the children are always trying to push a car out of the way so that the bus won't crash. So I used to seek those things out, and there was a very tangible desire to experience something, and I never did. But just putting myself in the situation was really enjoyable, and I probably got as close as I'm ever going to get, and I'll just accept that. But I used to be really I wanted it to be true, but I very much believed it wasn't, and I was pretty, almost snobby about it. It's like, no, I didn't go about debunking people, but if it came up, I would debunk it. But now I just listen and file it away. And I've met several, like probably 20 people in my life at this point who have really convincing stories that they share with me. And I'm not just talking about my mother experienced such and such, or my cousin. Like, these are people who are saying they experience things. Mm-hmm. So there's not that extra degree of separation there. And who am I to doubt a growing body of circumstantial evidence? People saying that these things happen to them. Who am I to doubt that? And it does start to seem like there has to be something, some kernel of truth in all of this stuff. And I still am not at a place where I've crossed that threshold of acceptance, but I see the door, it's ajar. I see the threshold. I know that it's possible, and I'll just, keep glancing over at that door every now and then just to see if anything's happened. But I'm a little more agnostic about it, whereas I used to be more of a supernatural atheist, so to speak.
Very skeptical then. Yeah. I gotcha. Very interesting. Yeah, you brought up Laird, and I've talked with Laird on a number of occasions, and he's very will tell you very clearly he's not a religious person in any sense, but he has seen enough things that are really hard to explain that he can't just write off the paranormal, the supernatural as a category of potential reality. He just can't write it off. There's just too many things that are too hard to explain, and I can respect that. Edward, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, briefly, what you guys are making me think about is my clinical practice. And so as a social worker, you're reminding me of people I've worked with that have like really highly traumatized backgrounds. I worked with somebody, and because of HIPAA, I have to be really vague, but they had a highly traumatized background and they reported to me having had a lot of supernatural experiences. Now, I'm not dismissing their experiences. I'm actually kind of wondering if their specific history opened them up more to whatever is beyond the veil, essentially. And I've worked with a number of other people who difficult things have happened to them, so they get more involved in pagan practices or the occult, or I'm open to it. I don't know what my tolerance of acceptance would be, because outside of kind of the things I'm thinking about, I don't know if I know anybody who's had ghost experiences, haunted experiences, whatever. But I'm open to the idea.
Thank you guys for that input. I just think this stuff's really fascinating. I want to switch gears real quick as we kind of wrap up. And this is a not very weighty question in light of all the things we've talked about, but I love horror comics. I grew up on comics. That's how I learned how to read. And I would love to know, do you have a story out of your catalog that you would most love to see adapted to comics? And if so, who would the dream artist be? Michael, do you have one in mind?
Well, graphic novel or comic series, I don't want to choose something that would just be one thin issue of one comic and that's it forever. So like kind of throwing out my short stories and not using any of those unless I used a story called October Film Hunt Under the House, which technically is the genesis of this novel. And I choose that because I have several other stories that are connected to that world.
Oh, wow.
And now I have a novel that's obviously connected as well.
But you have other stories that have not been published yet that are part of this world.
They've all, well, there's one that hasn't been published. I actually just wrote it. It's the first short story I've written in a long time. But to various degrees, I have 6 or 7 or 8 stories that are connected to the Pine Arch Research Group, which is connected to the October Film Hunt Under the House. Primarily a story called the Pine Arch Collection and my second collection, The Inconsolables. But yeah, coming back to the comic context, it would be really easy to more fully connect these stories together and have like a comic series that, one story might be 2 issues and then one story is really short. So it'd just be 1 issue, so forth and so on. And then they could be compiled in a graphic novel theoretically. And I like comics, but I rarely have time to really pay much attention to them. So I'm going to pick someone who is a great horror artist and I think could very easily move into the comics world. And I'll say Trevor Henderson.
Absolutely. Yes.
I just think, his way of seeing horror lines up fairly well a lot of times with my way of seeing horror. And I think he could really tap into that. And he also did illustrations for all the stories in my second collection, The Inconsolables, which actually led to him illustrating all the stories in Not a Speck of Light by Laird Barron, because they're both
from Bad Hand Books. That's right. That's right.
So I just think he could. Yeah, there's an example of
Nice.
the mime I mentioned earlier.
Yes.
So I just think, like particularly the photographs that Trevor takes and adds something freaky too. You know, like just kind of imagine that, but like on a more comic book palette. And I think he could really do a lot of great stuff in that regard.
I would love to see a Trevor Henderson comic book because I love the individual illustrations that I've seen him do. He even did I got a Trevor Henderson commission. He did an illustration of one of the children of Old Leech for me, and it's a really, really cool piece. Thank you, Michael. Nathan, do you have a story and an artist in mind?
I do. Skull Pocket.
Yeah.
Skull Pocket is a story about ghouls who have integrated with humans in this little town on the Chesapeake Bay. I think I could do a whole series of stories based on that town. And when I think of art, I love horror comics. So this is something I've thought about, independently from time to time. And artists, I could probably name a dozen that I'd love, but top two, I think, for this kind of medium, I mean, this tone is what I mean to say, is our Mike Mignola and Scotty Young. Scotty spelled with a K.
Wow. Oh my gosh. That'd be incredible. I'll tell you, my dream, and you've seen me post this on social media a number of times, but The Butcher's Table, illustrated by probably Patrick Zerker, after seeing his Solomon Kane work. I think he'd be incredible at this. Let's get the Kickstarter going and see if we can wrangle Patrick Patch into doing this. Well, thank you. I just love the idea of just taking these stories. I'd love to see them, adapted to film, adapted to comics, etc. Edward, go ahead.
I really used to appreciate the Spawn comics, Todd McFarlane. Yeah. I mean, they were awesome, and the worlds he created were awesome. If I was going to have Todd McFarlane do one of Michael's, I would do Caring for a Stray Dog Metaphors, because it's one of my favorite stories that you've done. I just think it's incredible. And if I was going to do one for Nathan, it would also probably be The Visible Filth, because excluding you guys' new material, The Visible Filth, I mean, the ending of that thing was just stunning. So while you guys were talking, I was just thinking about my fondness for Todd McFarlane and Spawn and The Redeemer, and they were just awesome when back in the day, and the art was awesome and the worlds were awesome. So that's my 2 cents on it.
Yeah. Everything was more awesome before Y2K. That whole decade, I call it Y2K'd. The whole first decade of the 2000s. It was just one disaster after another. Anyway.
Don't they call those the aughts? Isn't that the aughts?
The aughts.
Yeah, the aughts.
Yes, the aughts. Y2K'd. Okay, so as we wrap this up, what should people be looking for next? October Film Haunt is coming out on September 30 from St. Martin's Press. Everyone needs to read this, pre-order it. It's fantastic. I'm completely blown away by this book. And then we've got Cathedral of the Drowned coming out October 21 from Tor Nightfire. But if you haven't read Crypt of the Moon Spider, grab Crypt of the Moon Spider. Go ahead and get that. Read that first. There we go. Yes. Get that in the right order there. And that
Cathedral. I mean this in the most complimentary way. Cathedral of the Drowned was just batshit. I read it in basically one sitting in 2.5 hours, and 2/3 of the way through, I was like, this is just batshit. This is awesome.
It really goes in high gear. And those covers by Samuel Araya are just wonderful.
Just home runs.
Those are fantastic. I really like the UK edition of Crypt of the Moon Spider as well.
Yes,
I have one of those too.
Yeah, I'll get the UK edition of Cathedral of the Drowned too, because it's super cool. And Michael,
beautiful.
Oh my gosh, look at that! Oh, that's fantastic. I gotta order that. And then I do have the Inconsolables. Haven't read it yet. It's been on my TBR stack for a long time. But after Greener Pastures and October Film Haunt, this is going way up to the top. And I'm so excited to read that. I've been just completely blown away by your work, Michael. Tell us what else you guys have coming up. And I'm sorry. And Nathan, you have a story in the new anthology, Night and Day, from Ellen Datlow, that everyone needs to check out.
It's called Secret Night.
Yes. Does it fit into one of your? I haven't read it yet. I've got that volume. I'm so excited to dig into that story. Is it in one of like your existing universes or worlds? Okay,
No, it's entirely independent.
very good. I'm excited about that. Nathan, do you have anything else coming out between, let's say, in the next 12 months?
Well, maybe a short story or two. It depends on how things go. But the only certain thing, it will be Kingdom of the Conqueror Worm, hopefully coming out next October.
Awesome. Michael, how about you?
Yeah, like I mentioned, I just wrote my first short story in 4 years. I had a little bit of a breathing room between finishing my second novel and getting it back from my editor for edits. So it's brand new. I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but it'll be somewhere at some point. But the only other thing is that second novel, which you never know what's going to happen with scheduling, but it should come out around the same time as the October Film Hunt, but next year. So fall 2026.
Nice.
Is what
Can you say the title?
I'm sorry?
Can you say the title?
I'll say it's Night Jars.
All right.
As in the bird. Which in Georgia, the most common nightjar is a whippoorwill, but it's a larger family of birds that are nocturnal. And it's, very, 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 very dark and grim, and it's a meaner book. So I think people are gonna like it.
Interesting. All right.
It's me.
Good.
It's me taking on Redacted. I'm not gonna say anything else, but it's a classic Redacted novel.
Oh wow. Okay, that's a good teaser there. Very intriguing. I can't wait to read it. I'm so excited for the I'm following you guys. Everything you publish, I'm reading from here on out. So thank you so much for giving us your time, for joining us, sticking around for so long. And this has been very insightful. And I certainly encourage all of our listeners, go out and get the Cathedral of the Drowned and the October Film Haunt, and look up everything else these guys have written, because they're brilliant writers. Thanks again so much, and we will look for your future stories coming up soon.
Thank you so much. Have a great time.
Thank you guys very much.